Hey, Anonymous, I'm here with a video about your nervous system. There's going to be two videos that will be kind of overviews. The first is this one, and so we're going to call that Concept 1A, and this is an overview of the central nervous system. I will follow up with another video, which will be Concept 1B, and that will be an overview of the other part of the nervous system, which is called the peripheral nervous system. So let's just get started. So your nervous system is ultimately the control center of the whole body. It oversees communication among all of the different organ systems. It also gives you information about the world around you and the world inside you. And it is what allows you to do all of the actions that you do. So from taking a drink of your tea to singing a song or playing the guitar or kicking a soccer ball, all of those things are ultimately controlled by your nervous system. And so you'll get some information, and that could be information that is outside your body. So things that you can see or feel or hear, or they could be information about things that are happening inside your body. So maybe you're starting to feel hungry or you're feeling too warm. So that information is going to make its way to the brain and spinal cord, to the central nervous system, where it gets integrated. And this is where information is processed. And sometimes it might even be integrated with information that's been previously stored as a memory. So for instance, if you are feeling hungry, your memory might tell you like, oh, if I get up, I can go to the refrigerator and I could get a snack. And then your body will have that information. And so it's going to send an output out to the rest of the body to have an effect on a muscle or a gland or an organ, depending on what the appropriate response would be. So you have sensory input that's going to go to your central nervous system. And your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. The sensory input and the motor output are occurring outside of the brain and spinal cord. They're happening in the rest of your body, and we call that the peripheral nervous system. And so there are two parts of your peripheral nervous system we'll talk more about in the next video. There's a sensory portion and a motor portion where stuff happens. So stuff goes in, gets integrated in the central nervous system, and then there's an output which affects a change in the body. So as we're talking about this system, I think it's important to talk about what type of tissue the body is, this body system is made from. And if you remember correctly, that there are 4 different types of body tissues that we learned about earlier in the year. And so there's nervous tissue, there's connective tissue, there's epithelial tissue, and there's muscle tissue. And so nervous tissue is made up of a few different cell types. Remember, tissues are collections of different cells that work together, and then all together they create an organ, which then creates an organ system, which creates an organism. So the tissue is packed with different types of cells. So the main star of the show is the neuron. And this is an excitable cell that can respond to a stimulus by conducting an impulse that transmits a signal. And so the neuron has a cell body where the nucleus is, and then it has all of these little kind of extensions on it. So these ones are called dendrites. They receive information and then they get processed here in the cell body. And if there is enough information coming in, another impulse will go out of the cell body into the axon. And then that information gets transmitted to the next neuron or to a gland or a muscle or another organ in your body. That transmission is electrical until it gets to the very end, and then it's chemical. So there'll be something called a neurotransmitter that will help this communicate between different the other thing that it's connecting with. So whether that's a muscle, a gland, another organ or another neuron. So I like to think of the electrical impulse as sort of the voice box, and then the sound that comes out, like what right now that I'm getting I have a vibration in my voice box, and the sound that comes out is what you can hear. In this case, the vibration happens inside the nerve cell, and then what comes out is a chemical that can then communicate with another type of cell. A major part of the nervous system is something called neuroglial cells, or the neuroglia is the plural. And these are the supporting cast. So if our neuron is the star of the show, it's the astrocytes and the oligodendrocytes and the microglia, for instance, that help support them. So they provide nutrients. They might help insulate or to amplify the impulses that are being sent around. They may be in charge of clearing up any waste products that are floating around out in the tissue, or recruiting other types of cells like blood vessels that need to come and provide energy, or provide for nerve cells. So they're very, very important, and we're only just learning about them. So there's still a world of information that we just don't know yet about the neuroglia. So there's also one other vocabulary word or vocabulary type word that I want to point out, and that's nerve. And a nerve is just a bundle of neurons. So it's a bundle of nerve cells. And specifically, it's actually the axon portion of the nerve cell. So if we go back here, it's these long guys, and they get all wrapped up together in some connective tissue, like kind of like a fiber optic cable. So you'll have all of these different strands of neurons, the axons of neurons that are bundled up and wrapped up in a nerve. Nerves can be classified based on where they originate. So nerves that are receiving and giving information from the brain are called cranial nerves. There's 12 of those. If they are giving information to the spinal cord or receiving information, putting out information from the spinal cord, those are going to be the spinal nerves. And there is a nerve that arises between each vertebra of your spinal cord. So there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves that occur. And so nerves are considered part of the are considered part of the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. When communication happens within the central nervous system, within the spinal cord or the brain, we tend to call those pathways. There are some tracts that are within the spinal cord and the brain, but they're not neurons that are bundled together like a nerve. They may just be that they're just slightly different physically. So we call those tracts or pathways. But nerves themselves are only found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so I'm going to show you this flowchart, and we're going to return to this flowchart quite a lot. But this flowchart is going to tell us how the nervous system is organized. And so we just identified that there's something called the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's the nerves, the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is made up of two different types of nerves, two different divisions. So there's the sensory division, which is receiving information about the world around you, whether that's internal or external information. Then you have the motor division that's affecting a change. It's doing an action. The motor division then gets further divided. So there are things that you can control in the somatic nervous system. This word soma is the root of the word means body, and so this is how you can control your body. The autonomic nervous system kind of does what it sounds like. It's the automatic things that we don't have control over, the involuntary portions of keeping us alive. And then finally, this portion of the nervous system gets broken down into whether it's amplifying something in the sympathetic system or if it is turning something down, calming something down in the parasympathetic system. And so the autonomic system kind of works with a partner, just like our muscles did. There's an agonist and antagonist, essentially. And so something's going to be stimulating and something's going to be turning things down or countering that stimulation. So we're going to talk about this portion of the flowchart from the peripheral nervous system down in the next video. For this video, I just want to focus on the central nervous system. All right, so let's go back to that flowchart. Are sent just to kind of define what the central and peripheral nervous systems are. So your central nervous system is just your brain and spinal cord, everything that's kind of in these orangey red colors here. So brain and spinal cord. It's involved with integration and it's your control center. The peripheral nervous system are those spinal and cranial nerves. So cranial nerves arise from the brain. Spinal nerves are going to arise from the spinal cord, and their job is communication. So they're bringing in information to the spinal cord, which gets integrated, and then information goes out of the spinal cord in order to affect a change in the body or some kind of appropriate response to whatever that stimulus was. There's a word here that I want to point out because it's going to be, you're going to see it a lot as we go on. We haven't really described it yet. And that word is ganglion. And a ganglion is something that is, as a nerve is a bundle of axons of a neuron. A ganglion is a bundle of all of the cell bodies of a particular type of neuron. And so those ganglion can be outside the spinal cord or inside the spinal cord. We'll talk a lot more about that later, but I just wanted to point out this word because we haven't seen it yet. So a ganglion is a bundle of cell bodies, so the nuclei of neurons, where those extensions are going to be outside of the ganglion. Okay, so let's take a look at our brain. As you may remember, everything that is like vitally important in your body is going to be down the center of your body, and it's protected and encased in bone. And so just like your heart and lungs are surrounded by a literal cage in your rib cage, your brain is protected by the skull, and it's surrounded by several layers of tissue. So some of those tissues are called the meninges. So those are connective tissues. And we're not going to go into details about those, but you may have seen this word before if you've ever heard of meningitis. And that is an inflammation of the meninges. And that's something that can be either bacterial or viral. And it is something that does tend to happen to your age group more than it does to my age group, say. And so so maybe something that you've heard of before. And what happens in meningitis is that there's inflammation around the brain or the spinal cord, and it can cause some problems. But its main job is to cushion the brain from injury. And so it kind of holds the brain in place inside the skull. There's also cerebral spinal fluid that flows inside the brain, inside these ventricles. And the ventricles are just hollow, fluid-filled cavities. They're filled with this cerebrospinal fluid. And the cerebrospinal fluid circulates kind of like when you think about how blood circulates. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates within the brain and the spinal cord. And this happens a lot at night, especially. So it's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to sleep, is that it's a really good time that's the time that your cerebral spinal fluid really flushes out the waste products of the brain and goes into like circulation mode. There's an organ within the ventricle that is called the choroid plexus, and its job is to make cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so here's our brain, and we're going to talk about the brain as three main parts. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the brain in this course. I do teach a brain course that you're welcome to take another time if you want to get into the details. But for our purposes, we're basically going to break the brain into three portions. So we're going to talk about the cerebrum first, which is kind of everything above this yellow line here. And you'll notice that there are 4 different portions of the cerebrum that are named after the bones that they're underneath. So hopefully those look a little bit familiar. And the brain is also divided in 2. So if we were to kind of have you looking straight on and cut you in half into left and right sides, your brain is actually cut into left and right sides. So all of these things duplicate on the other side. So you have a right frontal lobe and a left frontal lobe. You have a right parietal lobe and a left parietal lobe, for instance. And then depending on the portion of the brain, there are different functions that take place. So those could be for learning or speech, emotion, reasoning, vision, hearing, kind of all the things you think about when you think about your brain. Those things are happening here in the cerebrum. The surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. So that's all of these ridges and valleys here. And the cerebral cortex is something that makes us like more, or sorry, makes us human, is we have a really big and highly sophisticated cerebral cortex. And it's got all these folds and valleys to increase surface area for those processes to take place. Okay, so underneath the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, which is this little guy here, which kind of looks like a mini brain. It's like a little mini me to the cerebrum. And its primary job is to maintain your posture and your balance. And I worked in the veterinary hospital when I was in college, and I adopted 2 kitties that had a cerebellar issue. They got a virus when they were still in their mother's womb or uterus. And when they were born, their cerebellum wasn't functioning typically. And so they had a really hard time, like with their posture. They had like really wobbly heads and they kind of fell over a lot. And they were just really uncoordinated. And so one of the things I think about in timing is like they would go to, you know, how kitties like to kind of pounce on something. Their timing was always way off and they would miss and they would like try to jump up onto the cat tree and they would miss. So we had to make ramps for them, my college roommates and I. And so, anyway, here I got to see what happens when your cerebellum isn't working the way it should do. But what it should do is maintain your posture and balance, and then also help for coordinating you into like a smooth and agile set of movements. Your brainstem is this little guy down here. It's super important. It is contiguous with your spinal cord, and it's right anterior to the cerebellum and just below your cerebrum. And so it has 3 parts to it. It includes the midbrain, which is the top part of it, and the pons, and then it also has the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata becomes the spinal cord ultimately. And its job is to relay information between like what's happening up here and the spinal cord. And it's kind of like this messenger person. Messenger, and it coordinates a lot of the functions that we don't think about. And in fact, it's probably the most ancient part of our brain, evolutionarily speaking, and it's a portion of the brain that we share with all other living vertebrates. Everybody has a brainstem, and then you have these kind of advancing layers as you go through evolutionary time. Animals that have evolved more recently, particularly mammals, have more of these upper layers of the brain. But everybody's got a brainstem, and it does a lot of your automatic functions. Like it helps you breathe, it helps your heart beat, it maintains your body temperature and your sleeping and waking hours, digestion and swallowing, and all of those functions are controlled in the brainstem. Okay, so leaving the brain, the spinal cord extends down through your spinal column, through your vertebra, and it extends from the medulla oblongata of the brainstem all the way down to your lumbar vertebra, kind of the upper border of lumbar vertebra 2, so just below where your ribs end. And then it kind of ends in this like wispy, flowing hair kind of structure that's called the cauda equina. And I'm sorry, that should say wisps of air. Cisps of air is not an actual word. So the cauda equina is sort of this horsetail looking thing at the very base of your spinal cord. And again, you have these peripheral nerves, your spinal nerves, that leave the spinal cord at each vertebra. And so, if we kind of think about the spinal cord structurally, and we think about each of these spinal nerves, they are going to be named after the portion of the spine that they originate or that they're bringing information to. So, you'll have your cervical nerves, and then we number them based on which cervical vertebra they kind of extend from. So, they'll be numbered from C1 to C8. And then your thoracic nerves are going to be numbered in the same way, depending on where they are in the thoracic spine, and then the lumbar spine, and then finally down into the sacral and coccygeal nerves. Each of the cervical nerves are involved with a particular portion of the body, and we call those dermatomes, and they become most apparent if somebody has a spinal cord injury, because what happens is that person will lose function below the level of the injury. So for instance, if somebody has an injury at C5, everything that is above C5 will still be functioning. That information is still going to the spinal cord and able to go out. Anything that is below C5 is no longer going to be functioning. So what you could expect in a person with a C5 spinal cord injury is that this portion of their body would still have sensory information and motor output, but the rest of the body would not. And likewise, if somebody had something at T8, everything below there would still function, would not function, but everything above it would. And so these are kind of useful, I think, just in terms of thinking about like what do each of these portions of the spinal column control or receive information from. And so it's color coded over here. So the cervical spinal cord innervates the green portions, the thoracic spinal column innervates the blue, lumbar is purple, and the sacral spinal cord are these red portions. And if you notice, a lot of your waste excretion functions are impacted by a sacral spinal cord injury, and because that's what controls urination or defecation. So it's just something those autonomic functions that we don't even think about get affected if there's a spinal cord injury. Okay, this is my last slide. And what we're looking at here is a sausage slice. So imagine we've turned this spinal cord on its side, and now we're cutting through it. And so we're going to be looking at it straight on as it's circular. So this is going to be the back side, so towards your backside, and this is going to be the ventral side towards your front, so dorsal and ventral sides. The reason I wanted to show you this is that is twofold. So one, we have white matter and gray matter inside the brain, inside the spinal cord, just like we do in the brain. The information from the body goes in through the dorsal horn or the dorsal root of the spinal cord. And we have a dorsal root ganglion. So this is where all of those cell bodies are going to be held. So information kind of comes in from the dendrites of the body, goes into the axon, and then enters the spinal cord through the back. That information, if it's coming from the body, somatic sensory nuclei, kind of gets processed here in this region. If it's coming from the internal organs or the viscera, it's going to be processed here in this information. And that tract runs all the way up to the brain and back within the spinal cord. If a decision is made that something needs to happen because we're getting information from the sensory nervous system, then the motor nervous system kind of will kick in here. And so that information gets relayed within the central nervous system in a similar way as it did here in the dorsal root. Same thing happens in the ventral root. We have our autonomic and our somatic portions of that ventral root. And then we have ventral root ganglion, which are inside the spinal cord. And then you have something that, or sorry, then you have your output, which is going to go out to your body and affect a change. And so whether that change happens on a muscle or a gland or another nerve, that all happens through this ventral root. So again, there's that word ganglion again. And it means that when information comes in from the rest of the body, it goes through this dorsal root ganglion, which is just a collection of cell bodies, goes into the spinal cord through the back, through the dorsal root, gets processed, sent up to the brain. Any information that happens in the brain is going to come back and get sent back down through this pathway, through this tract. And then there is another ganglion, which is inside the cell membrane here, inside the central nervous system, inside the spinal cord, that is then going to affect a change on the body by sending out a impulse through the ventral root to the nerves in the rest of the body. So depending on which portion of the spinal cord we're looking at would depend on which portion of the body it controls. So if this was a cervical spinal portion of the spinal cord, we'd be getting information about things in the head and neck and the upper torso. If this was an information that was if this was a lumbar portion of the spinal cord, we'd be getting information about what's going on in the lower half of the body and the legs. It's coming in here. And then any change that would be affected, if this was the lumbar portion of the spinal cord, that change would be happening in the lower body. And so this is kind of consistent throughout the whole spinal column. It's going to look like this if we were to do a sausage slice of it. So again, just to remind you, like each part of the spinal cord is involved in receiving information from particular regions of the body. Okay, that's all I have on the central nervous system. So we're going to wrap it up here. I will follow up with another video on the peripheral nervous system soon. Let me know if you've got any questions, and I look forward to seeing you in class soon. Bye for now.